Berlin, March 6, 1944, 0700 hours, and Oberstleutnant Heinz Bär, commanding the remnants of Jagdgeschwader 1 at Döberitz airfield just west of the capital, stared at the radar plot showing an armada of over 800 American bombers approaching from the west, accompanied by what the ground controllers insisted were single-engine fighters at 25,000 feet, which was impossible because no Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to reach Berlin from England, a round trip of 1,100 miles that exceeded the combat radius of even the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning when fully loaded for combat. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive doctrine against the American daylight bombing campaign rested on the fundamental assumption that bomber formations could only receive fighter escort to approximately the German border, leaving them vulnerable to concentrated attacks by Messerschmitt B F 109s and Focke-Wulf F W 190s during the critical penetration to targets deep inside the Reich. Yet the radar returns clearly showed small, fast-moving contacts weaving above the bomber stream in the characteristic pattern of escort fighters, causing Bär to wonder if the Freya radar operators had perhaps misidentified the returns or if atmospheric conditions were creating false echoes. His skepticism evaporated when Feldwebel Schmidt burst through the operations room door, breathlessly reporting that forward observation posts near Magdeburg had visually confirmed North American P-51 Mustangs escorting the bomber formations, their distinctive squared wingtips and laminar-flow wings unmistakable even at altitude, each aircraft carrying what appeared to be external fuel tanks under the wings that must have given them the range to reach Berlin, a technical development that German intelligence had completely failed to anticipate despite months of reports about increased Allied fighter production. The implication struck Bär with the force of a 1,000-pound bomb, for if American fighters could now escort their bombers all the way to Berlin and back, the carefully orchestrated defensive system that had inflicted devastating losses on unescorted bomber formations throughout 1943 would collapse, leaving the Reich's vital industries exposed to systematic destruction while the Luftwaffe's dwindling fighter force would be forced to engage not just heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators but also the agile, fast-climbing Mustangs that had already proven themselves superior to most German fighters at high altitude. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland had warned the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe about the potential threat posed by American fighter development, particularly after captured P-51B aircraft revealed the exceptional performance of the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine at altitudes above 20,000 feet. But neither he nor the technical experts at Rechlin had anticipated that the Americans would solve the range problem so quickly through the simple expedient of external drop tanks, which German fighters had actually pioneered with their 300-liter belly tanks but had never considered using for long-range escort missions. The morning of March 6 would demonstrate just how catastrophically the Luftwaffe had miscalculated, as Major Wilhelm Moritz led his group of 36 FW-190A8s from Jagdgeschwader 3 into what he expected would be another successful interception of American bombers beyond the range of their fighter escort, only to find himself bounced by P-51Bs of the 357th Fighter Group that had flown all the way from Leiston, England, their drop tanks jettisoned somewhere over Hanover, leaving them with full internal fuel for combat over the German capital. The evolution of American escort fighter capability had been closely monitored by Luftwaffe intelligence throughout 1943, with particular attention paid to the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts gradually extending range through the addition of belly tanks and improved fuel management procedures. But even with auxiliary fuel, the massive Thunderbolt could only reach approximately 400 miles from its bases in England, forcing it to turn back near the German border while bomber formations continued deeper into hostile airspace. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning possessed greater range potential, but its complex twin-engine configuration made it expensive to produce and maintain, while its poor heating system at high altitude caused numerous mechanical failures and pilot casualties from frostbite during the winter of 1943-44, limiting its effectiveness as a bomber escort over Germany. German fighter pilots had learned to identify the escort fighter's maximum range boundaries with deadly precision, timing their attacks to coincide with the moment the American fighters were forced to turn back, then pressing home concentrated assaults against the unprotected bombers with devastating results, as demonstrated during the October 14, 1943 raid on Schweinfurt when 60 B-17s failed to return from a force of 291, a loss rate of over 20% that forced the 8th Air Force to suspend deep penetration raids until adequate fighter escort could be provided. The North American P-51 Mustang had initially appeared over Europe in 1942 with the Royal Air Force, powered by an Allison V1710 engine that limited its effectiveness to low-altitude operations, making it unsuitable for bomber escort duties at the 25,000-foot altitudes where B-17 formations typically operated against German targets. The transformation of the Mustang from a mediocre low-altitude fighter to the supreme high-altitude escort fighter of the war occurred through the marriage of the American airframe with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, creating the P-51B model that began arriving in England with the 354th Fighter Group in November 1943, though German intelligence initially dismissed reports of its exceptional performance as Allied propaganda. The Merlin engine, with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, gave the P-51B a top speed of 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, faster than any German fighter at that altitude, except the new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter that was still months away from operational deployment, while its laminar-flow wing design provided exceptional range through reduced drag, enabling it to cruise efficiently at high altitude while consuming less fuel than other fighters. The real secret to the Mustang's unprecedented range lay not just in its aerodynamic efficiency, but in the British innovation of expendable external fuel tanks, particularly the 108-gallon paper drop tanks that had been developed by Colonel Cass Hoff and manufactured at Bowater Lloyd's paper mills in London despite American technical experts at Wright Field declaring them absolutely unfeasible and will not do the job for which they are intended. An assessment that proved spectacularly wrong, as more than 15,000 of these paper tanks were successfully employed without a single failure by early 1944. These tanks, constructed from kraft paper laminated with resorcinol formaldehyde glue and weighing only 90 pounds empty compared to the 160 pounds of equivalent metal tanks, could be mass-produced cheaply and quickly in British factories that had been converted from peacetime paper production, with workers in places like Bury, Lancashire, assembling them in 3 sections: nose cone, tail cone, and cylindrical body wrapped around wooden forms. The paper tank's light weight meant that P-51s could carry 2 of them, one under each wing, providing an additional 216 gallons of fuel that extended the fighter's combat radius from approximately 400 miles to over 750 miles, sufficient to reach Berlin with enough fuel remaining for 15 to 20 minutes of combat at maximum power before beginning the return journey to England. German fighter pilots had grown accustomed to a predictable pattern of American bomber operations throughout 1943, with P-47 Thunderbolts providing close escort to the Dutch border before turning back, leaving the bombers to continue alone into German airspace where concentrated attacks by Jagdgeschwader 1, 2, 3, 11, and 26 could be coordinated through the sophisticated fighter control system established by General Joseph Kamhuber, utilizing Freya and Würzburg radar stations to track incoming raids and vector interceptors to optimal attack positions. The system had proven devastatingly effective, particularly when combined with the new tactics developed by Oberstleutnant Egon Mayer of Jagdgeschwader 2, who pioneered the head-on attack against B-17 formations, exploiting the bomber's relatively weak forward armament of 450 caliber machine guns in the nose compared to the concentrated firepower in the tail and waist positions, requiring extraordinary courage and precision as German fighters closed at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour before breaking away at the last moment to avoid collision. These tactics, refined through bloody experience during 1943, had convinced many Luftwaffe commanders that the American daylight bombing offensive could be defeated through attrition, forcing the Allies to abandon precision bombing in favor of the RAF's night area bombing campaign, which, while destructive to German cities, was considered less threatening to specific military and industrial targets. The morning of March 6, 1944, shattered these assumptions as Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group, leading 16 P-51Bs on their first escort mission to Berlin, spotted a formation of 30 Bf 109 GSIXS from Jagdgeschwader 302 climbing to intercept the lead box of B-17s over Magdeburg, still 150 miles from the German capital. Howard's Mustangs had taken off from Boxted Airfield at 0530 hours, each aircraft carrying 2 75-gallon drop tanks that would be jettisoned when empty or when combat was joined, having carefully calculated their fuel consumption to ensure they could provide protection to the bombers throughout their bomb run over Berlin before beginning the long flight home. The German pilots, led by Hauptmann Friedrich Rupp, initially mistook the approaching fighters for P-47s that must be at the extreme limit of their range, expecting them to turn back at any moment, but as Howard's flight closed to engagement range and jettisoned their drop tanks in the characteristic puffs of vapor as residual fuel evaporated, Rupp realized with shock that these were P-51 Mustangs, the new American fighter that intelligence reports had mentioned but which no one expected to see. This deep in German airspace. The engagement that followed demonstrated the Mustang's superiority in every aspect of air combat above 20,000 feet, as Howard's pilots, trained in the aggressive tactics promoted by Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, dove on the German formation with a speed advantage of nearly 50 miles per hour, their 650 caliber machine guns converging at 300 yards to tear through the Messerschmitt's relatively light armor. Unteroffizier Werner Hoffmann, flying his 53rd combat mission, watched in horror as his squadron leader's aircraft disintegrated under the concentrated fire of a P-51B flown by Lieutenant Robert Goebel. The American fighter's superior speed allowing it to close to point-blank range before Hoffmann could even position himself for a defensive shot, while another Mustang piloted by Lieutenant James Dalglish swept in from the opposite direction, shooting down Oberfeldwebel Karl Richter with a deflection shot that would have been impossible for the slower-climbing P-47s or P-38s the Germans had faced before. Within minutes, 7 Bf-109s were spiraling down in flames while the surviving German fighters scattered, their pilots reporting to ground control that American escort fighters were not only present over Magdeburg but appeared to have plenty of fuel for sustained combat. A message that sent shock waves through the fighter control centers as controllers realized the implications for the bomber formations approaching Berlin. Reich's Marshal Hermann Göring, receiving reports at his Carenhall estate north of Berlin, initially refused to believe that American single-engine fighters could reach the capital, accusing his staff of defeatism and demanding visual confirmation from multiple sources before accepting the reality that would prompt his later admission. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up, though on this morning he still clung to the belief that these must be specially modified aircraft on a one-way mission or that they had somehow staged through Sweden in violation of that country's neutrality. The truth was far simpler and more devastating. American industrial capacity, combined with British innovation in drop tank design, had produced a solution that German technical experts had dismissed as impossible, creating paper fuel tanks that weighed less than half their metal equivalents while maintaining structural integrity at high altitude despite temperature extremes ranging from -50 degrees Fahrenheit to the heat generated by air friction during high-speed dives. The production of these tanks at British facilities, including paper mills that had converted from manufacturing cardboard boxes and brown paper envelopes, represented exactly the kind of Allied industrial cooperation that German planners had consistently underestimated, assuming that American and British production efforts would remain separate and uncoordinated, rather than combining their strengths to solve critical technical challenges. Major Heinz Nock, commanding a staffel of Bf-109 G-14s from Jagdgeschwader 11 based at Wunstorf, recorded in his diary that morning his disbelief when ground control reported P-51 Mustangs accompanying the bomber stream over Braunschweig, writing, "We had calculated their maximum range with auxiliary tanks at perhaps 500 miles, enough to reach Hamburg or Bremen but never Berlin. Yet here they were, weaving above the bombers in perfect formation as if they had all the fuel in the world," which forced us to completely revise our attack tactics as we could no longer count on dealing only with the defensive fire of the bombers themselves. The psychological impact on German pilots, who had grown accustomed to attacking unescorted bombers with relative impunity, was profound. As Lieutenant Gunther Rahl of Jagdgeschwader 11 later recalled, "The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin was like discovering the enemy had developed a weapon we thought impossible, destroying in a single morning the defensive strategy we had spent a year perfecting, and suddenly we were the ones being hunted rather than the hunters we had been." The German pilots attempting to reach the bomber formations now found themselves engaged by Mustangs that possessed not only superior speed and climb rate at altitude but also better visibility from their bubble canopies, allowing American pilots to spot attacking German fighters earlier and position themselves for advantageous bounces. The tactical revolution extended beyond mere fighter versus fighter combat, as General James Doolittle, who had assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, had fundamentally changed the escort fighters' mission from close protection of bomber formations to aggressive pursuit of German fighters wherever they could be found, freeing the Mustangs to range ahead of the bombers and catch German fighters while they were still forming up or recovering from previous attacks. This change in doctrine, combined with the Mustangs' extended range, meant that German fighters could no longer safely assemble at predetermined rally points beyond escort range, nor could they land to refuel and rearm without risk of being strafed by marauding Mustangs that retained enough fuel to conduct ground attack missions after completing their escort duties. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would become one of the war's top-scoring Mustang aces, demonstrated this new aggressive philosophy on March 6 by pursuing a formation of FW-190s all the way back to their airfield at Brandenburg-Brest, shooting down 2 aircraft in the landing pattern before strafing several more on the ground, actions that would have been impossible without the range extension provided by drop tanks. The bomber crews of the 8th Air Force, who had endured months of savage attacks during unescorted missions deep into Germany, watched with amazement and relief as P-51s dove past their formations to engage German fighters before they could press home their attacks, with Technical Sergeant Robert Jarvis, a waist gunner on B-17 Memphis Belle II of the 91st Bomb Group, noting in his combat diary, "We could see the little friends dropping their wing tanks as they went after the Jerry fighters. And for the first time since we started flying missions to Germany, we felt like we had a real chance of making it home without losing half the squadron, because those Mustang pilots were everywhere, hitting the Germans before they could even form up for their usual head-on attacks." The presence of escort fighters throughout the mission profile fundamentally altered the dynamics of the air battle, as German fighters could no longer concentrate on bombing accuracy but had to constantly watch for attacking Mustangs, while bomber gunners could focus on defensive fire against those German fighters that did penetrate the escort screen rather than trying to cover all approaches simultaneously. The Luftwaffe's response to the escort fighter threat revealed the institutional rigidity that had prevented German commanders from anticipating the drop tank solution, as fighter units were initially ordered to avoid combat with American fighters and concentrate on attacking bombers, an instruction that proved impossible to follow when P-51s aggressively pursued German fighters regardless of their attempts to disengage. Oberst Hannes Trotloft, inspector of day fighters, recognized the futility of these orders and argued for development of longer-range German fighters that could engage American escorts on more equal terms. But the resources required for such a program were already committed to jet fighter development and emergency fighter production to replace mounting losses. The German aircraft industry, despite achieving record production figures in 1944 with over 39,000 aircraft manufactured, could not solve the fundamental problem that their fighters were optimized for point defense rather than long-range operations, with the Bf-109G's combat radius of less than 300 miles making it impossible to pursue American formations back to their bases or maintain sustained operations at the distances required to defend the expanding American escort coverage. The technical aspects of the drop tank system that enabled the Mustang's long-range capabilities were remarkably simple yet ingenious, with pilots following a carefully planned fuel management sequence that maximized range while maintaining combat capability when needed. Upon takeoff from bases in East Anglia, P-51B pilots would first consume fuel from the fuselage tank behind the cockpit, which held 85 gallons but affected the aircraft's center of gravity when full, making it essential to burn this fuel first to restore proper handling characteristics before any combat maneuvering might be required. After consuming approximately 35 gallons from the fuselage tank, pilots would switch to the external drop tanks, which on March 6 were typically 75-gallon metal tanks, though the new 108-gallon paper tanks were already beginning to arrive at some squadrons, burning this external fuel during the cruise to the target area while maintaining economical throttle settings and altitude to maximize range. The drop tanks would be retained as long as possible, often until German fighters were actually sighted, at which point they would be jettisoned by pulling the emergency release handle, causing the tanks to fall away cleanly without affecting the aircraft's handling, though pilots had to be careful to ensure proper release as a hung tank would create dangerous asymmetric drag that could prove fatal in combat. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Bradley, commanding the 354th Fighter Group's 353rd Squadron, had thoroughly briefed his pilots on fuel management procedures during the pre-dawn mission briefing, emphasizing that they would have approximately 15 to 20 minutes of combat time at military power over Berlin before they would need to begin their return journey, carefully calculating fuel reserves to ensure they could reach England even if they encountered headwinds or had to deviate around weather fronts. The mathematics of fuel consumption had been worked out through careful testing and operational experience, with each Mustang consuming approximately 65 gallons per hour at cruise settings, but over 200 gallons per hour at full military power during combat, requiring pilots to constantly monitor their fuel gauges and make split-second decisions about whether to pursue a German fighter or conserve fuel for the return flight. The margin for error was slim, as Lieutenant William Bayer discovered when he pursued a Bf-109 too far east of Berlin and had to make an emergency landing in Sweden after exhausting his fuel reserves. Though most pilots learned to judge their fuel state accurately, and could stretch their range by careful throttle management and optimal altitude selection. The German Technical Intelligence Service, despite having captured several P-51B aircraft that had made forced landings in occupied territory, had failed to appreciate the significance of the drop tank system, focusing instead on the aircraft's engine performance and armament while dismissing the external tanks as a minor modification that would have minimal impact on operational capability. Hauptmann Karl Schnorrer, a technical officer at the Reckland Test Center where captured Allied aircraft were evaluated, later admitted, "We measured the Mustang's internal fuel capacity and calculated its range based on standard consumption rates, concluding it could perhaps reach the Ruhr Valley with a small combat reserve, but we never imagined the Americans would develop lightweight drop tanks that could extend the range so dramatically, and even when we recovered intact drop tanks from crashed aircraft, we assumed these were special ferry tanks rather than standard combat equipment." This failure of imagination reflected a broader problem within the Luftwaffe leadership, which had become so focused on defensive operations within German airspace that they could not conceive of escort fighters operating at the ranges the Mustangs achieved, similar to how Japanese naval commanders had dismissed reports of American carriers operating at extreme range until the Doolittle raid on Tokyo demonstrated otherwise. The impact of long-range escort fighters on German industrial production became immediately apparent as bombing accuracy improved dramatically when bombardiers no longer had to worry about fighter attacks during their bomb runs, allowing them to maintain steady courses and achieve better concentration of bombs on target rather than taking evasive action that scattered bomb patterns across wide areas. The synthetic oil plant at Luna, which had previously been considered too deep in German territory to attack effectively, now came under sustained assault from escorted bomber formations that could loiter over the target to ensure accurate bombing despite smoke screens and camouflage attempts, with production falling from 316,000 tons in March 1944 to just 54,000 tons by September as repeated raids prevented effective repairs. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, which had cost the 8th Air Force so dearly in 1943, were revisited with massive escort support that prevented German fighters from achieving the concentrated attacks that had previously driven off bomber formations, resulting in production delays that affected everything from tank transmissions to aircraft engines throughout German industry. The psychological warfare aspect of Mustangs appearing over Berlin cannot be overstated, as civilians who had been told repeatedly that the capital was beyond the reach of American daylight bombing now watched contrails streaming across the clear morning sky as hundreds of bombers and their escort fighters operated with apparent impunity over the heart of the Reich. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, who had consistently portrayed American bombing efforts as futile and costly failures that would soon exhaust themselves against German defenses, found it increasingly difficult to explain how enemy fighters could operate so deep in German airspace, eventually resorting to claims that these were special suicide missions or that the fighters had been catapulted from bombers, absurd explanations that even devoted Nazi Party members found hard to believe. The sight of P-51 Mustangs pursuing German fighters over Berlin suburbs, witnessed by thousands of civilians, destroyed the carefully constructed myth of the capital's impregnability and contributed to growing war weariness among a population that had endured years of RAF night bombing but had believed daylight attacks could be prevented. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, Germany's fighter commander and one of its most decorated aces with 104 aerial victories, recognized immediately that the appearance of escort fighters over Berlin represented a fundamental shift in the air war that would require radical changes in German fighter tactics and strategy, though he also knew that the institutional inertia of the Luftwaffe High Command would prevent rapid adaptation. In a heated conference with Göring on March 8, 1944, just 2 days after the first Berlin escort mission, Galland argued for concentration of fighter production on the new Me-262 jet fighter that could outrun any piston-engine escort fighter, but Göring, following Hitler's directive, insisted the Me-262 be developed as a bomber rather than an interceptor, a decision that would delay its operational deployment as a fighter until it was too late to affect the outcome of the air war. Galland also proposed withdrawing fighter units from other fronts to concentrate against the American bombing offensive, calculating that if German fighters could inflict sufficient losses on B-17 and B-24 formations despite their escort, the Americans might still be forced to curtail deep penetration raids, but this suggestion was rejected as defeatist by commanders who refused to acknowledge the severity of the crisis. The revolution in escort fighter capability coincided with a fundamental change in American fighter doctrine initiated by General James Doolittle, who had observed the RAF's experience with defensive fighter operations during the Battle of Britain and concluded that fighters were most effective when freed from close escort duties to pursue enemy aircraft aggressively. His controversial decision to release fighters from staying within visual range of bomber formations initially met resistance from bomber commanders who feared their crews would be left vulnerable. But the results of March 6 vindicated his approach as German fighter losses mounted while bomber casualties decreased significantly compared to unescorted missions. The new doctrine meant that P-51 groups could divide their forces, with one squadron providing close escort while others ranged ahead to break up German fighter formations before they could organize attacks, and a third squadron could sweep behind the bombers to catch German fighters attempting to reassemble after initial engagements, creating multiple layers of protection that made concentrated attacks nearly impossible. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of Adolf Galland and commander of Jagdgeschwader 20th AXS 2nd Gruppe, experienced firsthand the shock of encountering Mustangs deep in German airspace when his unit attempted to intercept B-17s approaching Hanover, still 200 miles from Berlin, only to be bounced by P-51 BS of the 357th Fighter Group that had been lurking in the sun above the bomber stream. His after-action report described the engagement in terms that revealed the psychological impact of the escort fighter's presence. "We had carefully positioned ourselves up sun from the bomber formation, waiting for their escort to turn back as they always did at this point, when suddenly tracer fire erupted around my aircraft and I saw Mustangs diving through our formation with complete surprise, their drop tanks tumbling away as they pressed their attacks with a ferocity we had not experienced from escort fighters before, pursuing individual German fighters rather than simply driving us away from the bombers as the Thunderbolts typically did. 5 of his 12 FW-190s were shot down in the brief engagement, with only 2 pilots surviving to be captured, while the remainder scattered without ever reaching the bombers they had been sent to attack. The production story behind the drop tanks that enabled the Mustang's long-range capability represented exactly the kind of Allied industrial cooperation that German planners had failed to anticipate, with British factories producing tanks designed by American engineers using materials and techniques that neither country could have developed independently under wartime constraints. The paper tanks, initially ridiculed by American technical experts who believed only metal tanks could withstand the stresses of high-altitude flight, were manufactured using kraft paper produced in British mills that had been converted from civilian production, with the resorcinol formaldehyde glue that bonded the layers coming from chemical plants that had previously manufactured adhesives for the furniture industry. Workers at facilities like the Bowater Lloyd plant in London, many of them women who had replaced men called to military service, could produce over 100 tanks per day once production techniques were refined, with quality control procedures that ensured less than 1% failure rate despite the seemingly fragile construction that led American test pilots to initially refuse to fly with them. The German response to the escort fighter threat evolved through several phases, beginning with denial that American fighters could actually reach Berlin, followed by desperate attempts to avoid fighter engagement while still attacking bombers, and eventually culminating in the development of specialized anti-bomber units equipped with heavily armed and armored FW-190A8 Sturmbach variants that could theoretically survive defensive fire long enough to press home attacks even with escort fighters present. These Sturmbach units, protected by lighter Bf-109s tasked with engaging the escorts, achieved some local successes but required such precise coordination that they rarely functioned as intended, with American fighters typically disrupting the formation before the heavily laden FW-190s could reach attack position. The added armor and weapons that made the Sturmbach effective against bombers also made them vulnerable to nimble P-51s, creating a paradox where aircraft optimized to destroy bombers became easy prey for escort fighters, forcing German pilots to choose between effectiveness against their primary targets and survivability against fighter opposition. Oberstleutnant Walther Dahl, commanding Jagdgeschwader 300, attempted to develop new tactics specifically to counter the escort fighter threat, proposing that German fighters should avoid combat entirely during the bomber's ingress, conserve fuel and ammunition, then attack during the return flight when American fighters would be low on fuel and ammunition after combat over the target. This approach showed promise in theory but proved difficult to execute in practice, as American fighter groups staggered their coverage to ensure fresh escorts were available throughout the mission profile, while German fighters attempting to shadow the bomber stream were themselves vulnerable to ranging P-51s that retained sufficient fuel to pursue them. The fundamental problem, which Dahl recognized but could not solve, was that German fighters designed for point defense simply could not match the endurance of American escorts purpose-built for long-range operations, creating an asymmetric battle where Luftwaffe pilots were always fighting at a disadvantage regardless of their tactical innovations. The impact on German pilot training programs was catastrophic, as the appearance of escort fighters over training bases in eastern Germany meant that even routine training flights became dangerous, with student pilots being shot down before they could gain the experience necessary to survive combat against veteran American fighter pilots. The Luftwaffe's training system, already strained by fuel shortages and lack of experienced instructors, collapsed entirely by mid-1944 as training bases were forced to relocate repeatedly to avoid marauding Mustangs, while the quality of new pilots declined precipitously as flight hours were cut from over 200 hours before combat assignment to less than 60 hours by summer 1944. Hauptmann Anton Haeckel, one of Germany's most experienced instructors with 192 aerial victories, reported that new pilots arriving at operational units in mid-1944 could barely maintain formation, let alone engage in combat against American fighters whose pilots averaged over 300 hours of flight time before entering combat, creating a qualitative gap that no amount of courage or determination could overcome. The Japanese military attaché in Berlin, Colonel Takashi Nato, observing the impact of American escort fighters on German defensive efforts, sent urgent communications to Tokyo warning that Japan faced a similar threat as American forces advanced across the Pacific, with B-29 superfortresses likely to receive P-51 escort once bases were established within range of the home islands. His prescient reports, which accurately predicted that Iwo Jima would be seized specifically to provide fighter bases for escort missions over Japan, were initially dismissed by Imperial Japanese Navy commanders who believed their own fighters could prevent American bombers from operating effectively regardless of escort, a miscalculation that would prove as costly as the German failure to anticipate drop tanks. When P-51DS began operating from Iwo Jima in April 1945, flying 1,500-mile round-trip missions to escort B-29s over Tokyo, Japanese pilots experienced the same shock their German counterparts had felt a year earlier, discovering that American industrial capacity and innovation had once again produced a capability that Axis planners had deemed impossible. The Italian Regia Aeronautica, observing the effectiveness of American escort fighters over Germany, recognized that their own air defense capabilities were wholly inadequate against escorted bomber formations, contributing to the Italian government's decision to seek an armistice in September 1943 rather than face the systematic destruction that Germany was experiencing. Marshal Italo Balbo, had he survived past 1940, would have likely recognized the significance of long-range escort fighters earlier than his German allies, having advocated for development of strategic bombing capabilities that would have required similar escort provisions, but his successors lacked both the vision and resources to develop comparable capabilities. The Macchi C-205 Veltro, Italy's best fighter aircraft, possessed excellent performance at altitude but had a combat radius of barely 200 miles, making it suitable only for point defense of Italian cities rather than the kind of extended operations American Mustangs routinely conducted, while Italian pilots, despite their skill and courage, found themselves increasingly relegated to defensive operations as Allied air superiority became overwhelming. The technical intelligence failure that prevented Germany from anticipating the drop tank solution reflected deeper problems within the Nazi regime's approach to warfare, which emphasized tactical innovation and qualitative superiority rather than the systematic, quantitative approach that characterized American military planning. German engineers had actually developed external fuel tanks before the war, with the Bf-109E7 carrying a 300-liter belly tank as early as 1940, but these were viewed as ferry tanks for extended deployment flights rather than combat equipment, with pilots trained to jettison them at the first sign of enemy contact rather than retaining them to extend combat radius. The conceptual leap from ferry tank to combat drop tank seems simple in retrospect but required thinking about air warfare in terms of sustained offensive operations rather than the defensive mindset that dominated Luftwaffe planning after 1943, a psychological barrier that prevented German commanders from anticipating American innovations even when the technical elements were clearly visible. Colonel Hub Zemke, commanding the legendary 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, which retained P-47 Thunderbolts even as most groups converted to Mustangs, developed tactics to maximize the effectiveness of mixed escort forces, with his heavily armed Thunderbolts providing close escort while faster, longer-ranged Mustangs swept ahead to engage German fighters, creating a complementary system that leveraged each aircraft's strengths. His group's experience on March 6, 1944, when they handed over escort duties to Mustang groups near Hanover and watched the P-51s continue all the way to Berlin, demonstrated the revolutionary impact of extended range on escort operations, as bomber formations that would previously have been vulnerable for over an hour now had continuous fighter protection throughout their mission. Zemke's tactical innovations, including the Zemke fan formation that allowed maximum flexibility in engaging German fighters while maintaining protective coverage of bombers, were quickly adopted by Mustang groups and became standard doctrine for the remainder of the war. The logistical infrastructure required to support long-range escort operations was itself a marvel of organization, with ground crews at bases across East Anglia working through the night to prepare hundreds of fighters for pre-dawn takeoffs, each aircraft requiring careful servicing to ensure reliability during 7-hour missions that pushed both machines and pilots to their limits. The drop tanks alone required extensive handling, with special trucks delivering them to dispersal points where they would be carefully attached to wing hardpoints, filled with aviation fuel, and checked for leaks or damage that could cause failure at altitude, while armorers loaded over 1,800 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition for the Mustang's 6 machine guns, knowing that pilots would need every round during the intense combats over Germany. The coordination required to launch, navigate, and control hundreds of fighters and bombers from dozens of airfields in weather conditions that could change rapidly was managed through a complex system of radio beacons, navigation aids, and predetermined rendezvous points that had to be precisely timed to ensure escort fighters met their bomber charges at exactly the right point to maximize coverage. The economic impact of successful escort operations extended far beyond the immediate destruction of German aircraft and industrial targets, as the certainty of encountering escort fighters forced the Luftwaffe to maintain larger reserves of fighters and pilots than would otherwise have been necessary, drawing resources from other fronts where they were desperately needed. The Eastern Front, where German ground forces were being steadily pushed back by the Red Army, received minimal air support after early 1944 as fighter units were withdrawn to defend against American bombing raids, while the Mediterranean theater saw German air strength reduced to token levels as every available fighter was needed to defend the Reich. This strategic air victory, achieved through the simple innovation of paper drop tanks costing less than $50 each, had effects that rippled throughout the German war effort, forcing difficult choices about resource allocation that ultimately contributed to collapse on all fronts simultaneously rather than allowing Germany to concentrate forces against specific threats. Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, who had commanded the 8th Air Force during the bloody battles of 1943 before being replaced by Doolittle, watched from his new position commanding Mediterranean Allied Air Forces as the escort fighter revolution he had desperately sought became reality through the combination of P-51 BS and drop tanks, vindicating his belief that daylight precision bombing could succeed if properly supported. His earlier attempts to extend fighter range through various expedients, including experiments with B-17s carrying fighters on trapeze attachments and proposals for aerial refueling that were technically beyond 1943 capabilities, demonstrated that American commanders had long recognized the critical importance of escort fighters but had been constrained by technological limitations that were only overcome through the fortunate convergence of British engine technology, American airframe design, and innovative drop tank development. The irony that the solution came from paper tanks manufactured in British factories rather than high-technology American solutions was not lost on Eaker, who noted that warfare often hinged on simple innovations rather than complex technological breakthroughs. The human dimension of the escort fighter revolution was captured in the experiences of individual pilots like Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group, who on March 6, 1944, flew his first mission to Berlin and discovered two Mi-262 jet fighters preparing to attack a straggling B-17, managing to shoot down both jets in what would be one of the first encounters between piston-engine fighters and jets in combat. His combat report, filed that evening after 7 hours in the cockpit, described the surreal experience of flying deeper into Germany than any single-engine fighter had gone before, watching the sun rise over Berlin's sprawling suburbs while German fighters rose to meet them in desperate attempts to reach the bombers, only to be driven off or destroyed by aggressive Mustang pilots who finally had the range to finish what they started. Drew's 2 victories over Mi-262s, achieved because the German jets were slow and vulnerable during their landing approach when he caught them, demonstrated that even Germany's most advanced technology could not overcome the strategic disadvantage created by American escort fighters operating freely over German airfields. The maintenance challenges of supporting long-range operations pushed American ground crews to extraordinary efforts, as P-51s returning from 7-hour missions often had numerous bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, and engines stressed from extended combat at high power settings, requiring rapid repairs to prepare for the next day's mission. Master Sergeant William Patterson of the 355th Fighter Group's maintenance squadron developed innovative repair techniques using fabric patches and quick-drying dope that could restore damaged control surfaces overnight, while engine mechanics learned to diagnose and fix problems caused by the extreme temperature variations encountered during high-altitude operations over Germany, where temperatures could drop to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The reliability of the Packard-built Merlin engines proved exceptional, with less than 2% mechanical failure rate despite the stresses of extended operations, though ground crews still performed complete inspections after every mission, knowing that a single mechanical failure over Germany meant certain death or capture for the pilot. The intelligence war surrounding escort fighter capabilities continued even after Mustangs had demonstrated their range over Berlin, with German intelligence services attempting to determine the exact composition and capacity of drop tanks through analysis of recovered examples and interrogation of captured pilots, while American counterintelligence spread disinformation about even longer-ranged variants under development. The Germans never fully understood that the paper drop tanks were being mass-produced in such quantities that they were essentially disposable, assuming instead that metal tanks must still be the primary type employed and calculating American fighter range based on the heavier, less efficient metal designs, leading to continued underestimation of escort fighter capabilities. This intelligence failure persisted even as German pilots reported encountering Mustangs at ranges that should have been impossible with metal tanks, with staff officers dismissing pilot reports as exaggerations or misidentification rather than accepting that their calculations were fundamentally flawed. The strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness increased dramatically with escort fighter protection, as evidenced by the attack on Berlin's industrial suburbs on March 6, 1944, when 730 bombers dropped over 2,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries with the loss of 69 bombers and 11 fighters, a loss rate of less than 10% compared to the 20% losses suffered during unescorted raids in 1943. The psychological impact on bomber crews was profound, with morale soaring as gunners reported seeing Mustangs pursuing German fighters all the way back to their airfields, while navigators could plot direct routes to targets rather than the evasive patterns previously required to avoid fighter concentrations, reducing fuel consumption and increasing bomb loads. The certainty of escort coverage also allowed bomber formations to fly tighter patterns that concentrated defensive firepower against any German fighters that did penetrate the escort screen, while bombardiers could take longer to line up their targets without fear of sudden fighter attacks disrupting their aim. General Karl Spaatz, commanding United States strategic air forces in Europe, recognized that the escort fighter breakthrough created an opportunity to shift from attacking German industrial targets to directly destroying the Luftwaffe as a fighting force, initiating Operation Argument in February 1944, known as Big Week, which saw massive coordinated raids against German aircraft factories with full escort coverage. The operation's success, destroying or damaging over 75% of German fighter production facilities while shooting down over 500 German fighters in aerial combat, demonstrated the decisive impact of escort fighters on strategic bombing effectiveness, validating pre-war theories about daylight precision bombing that had seemed discredited by the costly raids of 1943. Spaatz's decision to prioritize destruction of the Luftwaffe over other strategic targets proved correct, as German fighter strength never recovered from the losses inflicted during the spring of 1944, with monthly production unable to keep pace with combat losses despite Albert Speer's efforts to disperse and protect aircraft factories. The technological race between escort fighters and interceptors accelerated as Germany desperately sought solutions to the Mustang threat, including rocket-powered Me-163 Comet interceptors that could climb to bomber altitude in minutes but had such limited endurance they could barely engage before gliding back to base, and heavily armed bomber destroyers like the Me-410 that proved too slow to evade escort fighters. The Me-262 jet fighter offered genuine superiority over piston-engine escorts with its 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, but Hitler's insistence on developing it as a bomber rather than a fighter delayed operational deployment until autumn 1944, by which time American escort fighters were operating in such numbers that even jets could be overwhelmed by coordinated attacks. The fundamental problem Germany faced was not technological but numerical and logistical. Even if every German fighter had been a jet, they lacked the fuel, pilots, and airfields to contest American air superiority effectively, while American production continued to increase, with over 15,000 P-51s eventually manufactured compared to barely 1,300 Me-262s. Major Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77 and later one of the few senior Luftwaffe officers to successfully transition to jet fighters, wrote in his post-war memoirs about the moment he realized Germany had lost the air war. "It was not when Berlin was bombed or when our losses mounted, but when I saw Mustangs leisurely circling over our airfield at Münster, waiting for us to take off so they could shoot us down in the landing pattern, that I knew we had not just lost air superiority, but had become the hunted rather than the hunters. Reduced to sneaking into the air when weather provided cover rather than rising to meet the enemy as we had done with such pride in earlier years, his experience reflected that of countless German pilots who found themselves psychologically defeated by the omnipresence of American escort fighters, knowing that every mission might be their last not because of bomber defensive fire, which they had learned to accept and counter, but because of aggressive Mustang pilots who pursued them relentlessly, with superior aircraft and seemingly unlimited ammunition. The impact on German civilian morale as escort fighters appeared regularly over German cities cannot be overestimated, particularly as P-51 pilots began strafing targets of opportunity during return flights after escorting bombers to their targets, attacking trains, vehicles, and even individual soldiers visible from the air, creating an atmosphere of constant danger that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of bombing targets. Civilians in rural areas who had felt relatively safe from air attack suddenly found themselves diving for cover as Mustangs roared over at treetop level, their 6 machine guns devastating anything that moved, while the psychological effect of seeing American fighters operating freely in broad daylight over the heartland of the Reich shattered any remaining illusions about Germany's ability to defend its airspace. The propaganda ministry's attempts to minimize the significance of escort fighters by claiming they were operating at the extreme limit of their range and suffering heavy losses from fuel exhaustion rang hollow as the same fighter groups appeared day after day, their numbers seemingly increasing rather than diminishing despite German claims of victories. Colonel Donald Blakesley, whose 4th Fighter Group had been first to escort bombers to Berlin on March 4, 1944, developed the aggressive philosophy that would characterize American escort operations for the remainder of the war, telling his pilots, "Your job is not to protect bombers but to destroy the Luftwaffe wherever you find it, in the air, on the ground, taking off, landing, or parked, because a German fighter destroyed is one that will never attack our bombers again." His approach, initially controversial among bomber commanders who wanted close escort, proved devastatingly effective as German fighter losses mounted not just from aerial combat but from relentless strafing attacks on airfields that destroyed aircraft, fuel supplies, and maintenance facilities, creating a cascade effect where operational readiness declined even faster than aircraft losses would suggest. The psychological impact on German ground crews, who found themselves under attack from strafing fighters while trying to service aircraft, contributed to declining maintenance standards that further reduced the Luftwaffe's effectiveness. The supply chain that supported long-range escort operations represented a triumph of Allied logistics, with fuel supplies alone requiring careful planning as each Mustang consumed over 300 gallons per mission including drop tank fuel, meaning a single group of 50 aircraft required 15,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel daily, delivered by tanker trucks from ports where Liberty ships discharged their cargo of American refined fuel. The ammunition supply was equally demanding, with each Mustang carrying 1,800 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition weighing over 400 pounds, fired in bursts that could empty the magazines in less than 30 seconds of continuous fire, requiring careful marksmanship to ensure ammunition lasted through potentially multiple engagements during a 7-hour mission. The coordination required to ensure every aircraft had fuel, ammunition, drop tanks, and functioning equipment for pre-dawn takeoffs 7 days a week regardless of weather conditions demonstrated the organizational superiority that complemented American industrial capacity. Wing Commander Douglas Bader, the legendary legless RAF ace who had fought in the Battle of Britain, observed American escort operations from his position as a prisoner of war in Colditz Castle, noting through clandestine intelligence networks how the appearance of Mustangs over Germany had fundamentally changed the air war in ways the RAF's night bombing campaign never could have achieved. His analysis, written secretly and hidden until after the war, correctly identified that American escort fighters had achieved what years of bombing had failed to accomplish: the complete demoralization of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force through relentless attrition that prevented any possibility of recovery or reorganization. The contrast with RAF strategy, which relied on night area bombing to destroy German cities and industrial capacity, highlighted the different philosophies of the two air forces, though Bader acknowledged that both approaches were necessary and complementary in ultimately defeating Germany. The Japanese observer mission in Berlin, led by Naval Attaché Captain Tadao Yokoi, studied American escort fighter tactics intensively in preparation for the anticipated B-29 offensive against Japan, correctly concluding that Japan would face the same crisis Germany experienced once American forces seized bases within P-51 range of the home islands. Their reports to Tokyo emphasized the psychological impact of escort fighters on both military and civilian morale, noting that the appearance of American fighters over Berlin had done more to convince ordinary Germans the war was lost than years of bombing, because it demonstrated American ability to project power at will rather than simply dropping bombs and fleeing. These observations influenced Japanese defensive preparations for the anticipated invasion, though like their German counterparts, Japanese commanders underestimated American industrial capacity and innovation, failing to anticipate that P-51DS would eventually fly 1,500-mile round trips from Iwo Jima to escort B-29s over Tokyo, exceeding even the remarkable range achievements demonstrated over Germany. The cost-effectiveness analysis of the drop tank innovation revealed extraordinary returns on minimal investment, with paper tanks costing less than $50 each, enabling destruction of German industrial capacity worth billions of Reichsmarks while protecting bomber formations worth millions of dollars from fighter attack. The 15,000 paper tanks produced by British factories, representing a total investment of less than $1 million including development and production costs, enabled the destruction of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force, a strategic victory that would have seemed impossible at any price during the dark days of 1943 when unescorted bombers were being slaughtered over Germany. The contrast with German investment in advanced weapons like V-2 rockets, which consumed enormous resources for minimal strategic impact, demonstrated the importance of identifying and exploiting simple solutions to complex problems rather than pursuing technological complexity for its own sake. The weather implications of long-range escort operations added another dimension to mission planning, as fighters flying 7-hour missions had to account for weather changes across 1,000-mile distances and time spans that could see clear skies at takeoff become solid overcast by return, requiring sophisticated meteorological support and alternate landing fields. The development of weather reconnaissance flights specifically to support escort operations, with modified Mosquitoes flying high-speed runs along planned routes to report conditions, represented another innovation driven by the requirements of long-range operations, while pilots learned to interpret weather patterns and make independent decisions about fuel reserves based on anticipated conditions. The ability of American fighters to operate in weather conditions that grounded German interceptors, using superior radio navigation aids and instrument flying training, provided additional advantage that multiplied the impact of numerical superiority. General Adolf Galland's post-war testimony at Nuremberg included extensive discussion of the escort fighter revolution, which he identified as the single most decisive factor in the Luftwaffe's defeat, more important than numerical inferiority, fuel shortages, or pilot training deficiencies because it rendered all German defensive planning obsolete overnight. His bitter observation that Germany had possessed all the technical elements necessary to develop long-range escort fighters, but had failed to combine them due to doctrinal blindness and institutional rigidity, provided a sobering lesson in the importance of flexible thinking and adaptation in warfare. The tragedy, from the German perspective, was that they had actually pioneered many of the technologies involved, including drop tanks, supercharged engines, and efficient airframes, but had never synthesized them into an effective long-range fighter because their entire air doctrine was based on tactical support and point defense rather than strategic air warfare. The manufacturing techniques developed for paper drop tank production had unexpected post-war benefits, as the same lamination and forming technologies were adapted for civilian products ranging from furniture to automotive components, while the quality control procedures developed to ensure tank reliability at high altitudes influenced industrial standards throughout British manufacturing. Workers who had produced drop tanks during the war found their skills in demand for precision manufacturing operations, while the factories that had converted from civilian production demonstrated the flexibility of industrial infrastructure when properly motivated and organized. The success of paper tank production also validated the concept of distributed manufacturing, with components produced at multiple sites and assembled at central locations, a model that would influence post-war industrial organization and eventually contribute to modern just-in-time manufacturing concepts. The last German daylight fighter attack on Berlin occurred on April 10, 1945, when Oberst Johannes Steinhoff led 7 Me-262 jets against a formation of B-17s escorted by over 200 P-51DS. A hopeless gesture that resulted in 5 jets destroyed for no bombers shot down, demonstrating the complete reversal of fortune from the days when German fighters had massacred unescorted bombers with impunity. Steinhoff himself was severely burned when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff during a scramble against approaching Mustangs, ending his combat career and symbolizing the final collapse of German fighter resistance against the overwhelming tide of American escort fighters. The bitter irony that Germany's most advanced fighter was reduced to futile gestures against massive escort forces while burning irreplaceable fuel and losing irreplaceable pilots demonstrated the completeness of the strategic victory achieved through the simple innovation of drop tanks that had extended Mustang range to Berlin and beyond. The legacy of the escort fighter revolution extended far beyond World War II, establishing principles of air superiority and force projection that would influence military aviation for decades, with modern aerial refueling representing the evolutionary descendant of drop tank technology in extending fighter range for global operations. The lesson that technological superiority meant nothing without the range and endurance to employ it effectively was absorbed by air forces worldwide, while the importance of escort fighters in enabling strategic bombing became doctrine that influenced everything from the development of long-range fighters during the Cold War to modern suppression of enemy air defense operations. The psychological impact of achieving air superiority through extended range rather than purely through combat effectiveness demonstrated that strategic victories often came from solving logistical challenges rather than tactical ones, a lesson that would be repeatedly validated in subsequent conflicts from Korea to Desert Storm.